You have likely heard many stories about teenage serial killers, such as Arati Neiman, who was sentenced to death at 15 for 2 murders, or Vladimir Nikolaev, who killed 8 people and left 10 others injured by the age of 16. Today, we are discussing a killer who began living alone in the forest at the age of 11 and started killing just a few years later. Inspired by Kipling, the author of the Jungle Book, we now refer to children raised by wild animals as Mowglis. Journalists gave this same nickname to the murderer we will talk about today. However, unlike his namesake, this criminal grew up from early childhood in a completely inhumane family and was accustomed to hiding in the forest after his murders. The most astonishing part is that he was still a child. He lived alone in the forest from the age of 11 and later emerged to bludgeon helpless elderly pensioners to death. Today's story is about the Belgorod Mowgli. In these difficult times for YouTubers, I am very grateful for your support in the form of likes and comments. I want to remind you that by liking this video, you are supporting my work for you, not endorsing the terrible story. The year was 2004, in the Krasnoyarsky district of the Belgorod region, Russia. On a gloomy day, an elderly man went to check on his 83-year-old neighbor, Ivan Martinchenko, also a pensioner. He immediately noticed the open gate and the door to the shed. What had happened? A few seconds later, the man was shocked. Upon entering the shed, he saw a mutilated corpse. Within just 20 minutes, investigators were on the scene. A bent knife was found beside the body. Experts determined that the unknown assailant had stabbed Ivan Martinchenko 4 times in the chest. But the murderer was not satisfied with that. When the knife bent, he grabbed a hammer and beat the unfortunate pensioner until there were no more signs of life. Who could commit such a brutal attack? And, most importantly, why? The first thing that caught the investigators' attention were the imprints of bare feet. If these were the traces of a madman, why was he not wearing shoes? What kind of savage was at the crime scene? The investigators began checking all possible theories. If it was a robbery, could the murderer have been interested in the old man's modest pension? The man had fled, spent the night there, and, upon being discovered, attacked the man and stabbed him. It turned out the perpetrator had intended to spend the night in the shed, but attacked the pensioner after being found. Why was the perpetrator barefoot? Who was he? An unemployed man? A random passerby? The investigators questioned the locals. Perhaps someone had seen a suspicious man running through the village without shoes. Unfortunately, there were no witnesses. Not even 3 days later, the local police station received a new report of a murder. The elderly pensioner Maria Salyak was found murdered in her own home. The grandmother's body was discovered by her friend. She lay on the floor, covered in blood. As the arriving investigators determined, the grandmother had been beaten to death with an iron rod. The murder weapon was found next to the body. The crime scene was completely ransacked. Silver earrings, 2,000 rubles, and the old suit of the deceased husband were missing from the house. Furthermore, the perpetrator had held a veritable feast. The dining table was littered with food scraps, and bones were scattered on the floor as if by animals. After finding footprints, it became clear it was the same perpetrator. Even valuable items were taken from the house at Akam: a watch, bags, a razor, an umbrella, and even cookies and candies. The information that a madman was on the loose in the area, attacking pensioners, instantly spread among the locals. Panic broke out. Older people were afraid to go outside, as any one of them could be the monster's next victim. The investigators began questioning the neighbors, and this time one of the men gave a statement. The witness reported seeing a young man jump over the victim's fence. He was barefoot but wearing a suit. A sketch of him was distributed throughout the region. Meanwhile, a large-scale police operation began in the forested area. Armed police officers walked in a line, spaced 10 meters apart. It seemed the criminal had nowhere to go. A few hours later, the investigators came across a hut in the forest. Inside, they found personal items belonging to the murdered Maria, which were later identified. The ruthless murderer's hideout had apparently been found. The law enforcement agencies assumed the perpetrator would return to his hut sooner or later. However, he already knew he was being hunted. A week into the search, a former district police officer came to the police station. The man wanted to chat with friends and happened to see the sketch of the perpetrator. The former officer immediately said, "That's Alexander Greba from the village of Moshchanoi." He recognized him because he had once been involved in his arrest. It turned out that Greba had been convicted of murder years earlier and had recently been released from prison. The investigators immediately went to the village of Moshchanoi, where the relatives of the suspected murderer lived. Now, it was only a matter of finding out who Alexander Greba was and why he lived as a hermit in the forest. The investigators uncovered everything about his past. Greba was born on September 23, 1980, in the village of Moshchanoi Yakovlevsky district, Belgorod region, Russia. Alexander's parents divorced before he was 2 years old. His father, Ivan Greba, could no longer bear his wife, who constantly started fights. Valentina Greba drank, led a promiscuous life, and had hysterical fits. After divorcing Ivan, little Sasha stayed with his mother. She later remarried and even seemed to improve. With Vasily Kulinich, she had 3 more daughters, but her second husband also soon left her. During the time Vasily lived with Valentina, he loved Alexander and raised him like his own son. But soon history repeated itself. The woman started drinking and living a promiscuous life again. She no longer took care of her younger sisters because their mother was constantly on drinking binges. And when she came home, there were regular arguments. By the age of 7, Sasha Greba attended school number 2 in the village of Krasnaya Yaruga, where he was considered withdrawn. Despite his love for literature and reading, he did not take his studies seriously. In the 7th grade, he dropped out of school altogether. At school, little Sasha was accused of stealing. The family had nothing to eat, so, at the age of 10, the boy began stealing food for his sisters, but his mother was still dissatisfied. The only place where Sasha wasn't beaten and shouted at was the forest. It was quiet and peaceful there. There, the boy built a hut, which became a new home for him. He collected berries and mushrooms and learned to fish in the river without a fishing rod, using sharpened sticks. The years passed, and Alexander gradually became an outcast. At 15, a real beast awakened within him. One evening, the cold drove Alexander out of the forest. The teenager sneaked into the nearest village and hid in the first chicken coop he found. In the morning, he drank 2 raw eggs when the homeowner entered the shed at that moment. The elderly woman shouted at Alexander and reached for a stick. Later, Greba himself recounted that at that moment, everything in his head became confused, and an image of his mother appeared before his eyes. In that moment, he decided that no one would ever shout at him again. Alexander took an iron bar and bludgeoned the pensioner to death. The teenager was arrested at the crime scene. The desperate screams had brought neighbors who overpowered Alexander. The 15-year-old was sentenced to 8 years and 10 months in prison. At 25, he returned to his home village. The search for Alexander Greba, suspected of the brutal murders, was placed under special control by the Belgorod Police Department. But where was the murderer hiding after his hut was discovered? Wanted posters were hung on every post. His photo was shown on local television and published in local newspapers. And news of the murderer was not long in coming. A woman called the police and reported that a similar-looking man had come to a street cafe. The police arrived at the location only 30 minutes later. By that time, the suspected perpetrator had already eaten lunch and, according to witnesses, had gone into the forest. The officers waited for reinforcements, hoping Alexander Greba would be captured. But after some time, it began to rain heavily, washing away the man's tracks and causing the dogs to lose his scent. In all surrounding settlements, residents formed civilian squads to help search for the brutal criminal. Tension rose. A few days later, one of the locals discovered an unknown man in a cowshed and almost stabbed him with a pitchfork. Alexander had already been on the run for 3 weeks when he made news again. In the pictures, you can see a small house where two elderly women lived, the 73-year-old Nina and her neighbor. On that day, the neighbor came to visit and almost fainted. The yard was full of blood. The paramedics who were called took the survivor to the hospital. There, she was diagnosed with a severe traumatic brain injury and a brain contusion. The old woman lived for a few more days, then died. The investigators began to examine what had happened in the small house. The pensioners had allowed residents who had argued with their spouses or run away from home to spend the night in their house. That evening, the grandmothers also did not refuse to take in an unknown man who asked for shelter from the rain. When the investigators began questioning the residents, they showed a sketch to the driver of a local church. He explained that the man in the picture had come and asked for work, but was refused. After that, Greba moved on and found two old women in the same village who allowed him to stay with them. But why did Alexander kill the pensioners? There were two theories. Either the grandmothers had recognized him as the murderer the entire region was looking for, or he wanted to steal their money. The search for the serial killer was not interrupted for a single day. The police continuously received new reports from citizens. The criminal had been seen somewhere in a shop. The murderer had stolen a bicycle somewhere. He had undressed in front of residents somewhere. The police were literally on his heels. People were afraid to leave not only their property, but even their own gardens. Galina, the daughter of one of the residents, entered the house and saw that her mother was not alone. A stranger was there, and on the table was a half-eaten meal. She saw the madmen roaming around but did not enter. Galina began to inspect the property. No one was in the house or on the grounds. Only the shed remained. When she looked inside, the woman saw an open loft that had never been opened before. When she cautiously looked in, she saw a sleeping man. At that same moment, the stranger opened his eyes and lunged at Galina. She barely managed to run out and lock the door. The stranger screamed and tried to kick the door in, as there was no other exit from the shed. With trembling hands, the woman took out her phone and called the police. The officers arrived within minutes. With drawn weapons, they approached the locked door, ready to arrest the man. However, the perpetrator had armed himself with an axe. When the door was opened and he saw the pistol, he threw the weapon away and surrendered. The man arrested was Alexander Greba. He said, "Let me out. Get out of here." He wanted to go out, saw the gun and dropped it. He explained how he had felt at that moment. If there had been no gun, I would have fought to the last breath and killed him. But when I saw the black muzzle, it was all over. What drove him to murder? A few weeks before the series of attacks began, Alexander was released from the penal colony. The man knew no one was waiting for him at home. His mother was an alcoholic. His sisters were being raised by their stepfather. The only person close to him was his aunt. After his release, Greba went to her. After talking all night, the woman made it clear she could not take him into her apartment, as she had learned he was an ex-convict. After spending a few nights at his aunt's, Alexander tried to contact a former classmate, but she only laughed at him and said, "You were a goblin and still are one." Greba began to worry greatly and, as in his childhood, sought solace in the forest. But Alexander could not live long on berries, mushrooms, and fish. Hunger forced him to go among people and, ultimately, to kill. During interrogations, the madman did not even try to defend himself. He recounted all his crimes in detail, how he broke into strangers' houses looking for food or shelter from the weather, how he killed the inhabitants without hesitation. Alexander could not bear shouting. He immediately returned to his childhood. After each murder, Greba fled to the forest. There he was untraceable. He knew the forest very well. Alexander had never consumed alcohol or illegal substances. According to his own statements, he devoted all his free time to reading. The investigators noted that he was very calm during all interrogations. The investigation did not take long. Greba immediately confessed to all committed crimes and actively cooperated with the investigators. After all interrogations and investigative measures, the accused underwent a comprehensive psychiatric examination. The results confirmed that the perpetrator was fully aware that he had killed innocent pensioners. Alexander was brought to trial and sentenced to life imprisonment in Penal Colony No. 18 with a special regime, known as Polar Ole. Greba tried to appeal the verdict and filed cassation appeals to the Supreme Court. In his appeal, he wrote, "I don't know why I'm writing this. Yes, I am guilty, but I had no past. I have no present. Don't take my future away too." Previously, however, he had confessed to another crime, but the officials considered his statement false. They concluded that Greba had deliberately incriminated himself to be brought back to his homeland, where he might try to escape into the forest. It was established that the person Alexander named was not on the missing persons list. Although he had allegedly also named the location, his statement was disregarded. The confession was filed away as it was deemed unreliable. There were no such persons among the missing. Out of loneliness, Greba writes to all his relatives, his mother, his stepfather. However, Greba is still alive and serving his life sentence to this day. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.